Hello, everybody. Good morning and welcome. Arnobio Morelix here, calling from San Francisco. Started today as a pretty cloudy day here, but I'm hoping it opens up. Uh, before I introduce myself, uh, I want to share a little bit with you. First, about the agenda of the things we will cover today, and then a little bit about this webinar series. So, today we'll cover the topic of this X-ray vision of your ecosystem. Really focus on understanding and benchmarking your innovation economy. And what you can see on the screen now is the agenda of what we will cover. We're gonna start with an introduction. We're gonna share a bit why this is important. Why do we care about this topic at all? Why do we particularly care about it now? Then I'm going to share with you a bit about how startup genome tracks and globally benchmarks startup ecosystems, and really cover a lot of things we don't usually talk about in public. After that, I'll share a little more about global learning and our global membership program, which is group of people like you, your peers around the world, and how they learn together. We're going to talk about what's the impact, why do we use all this stuff? What does that mean for the local economies to do the work we'll share about it here? And then we're going to have open questions and comments. And what I want to ask you is that as you have questions throughout the presentation, please share them on the Q&A in the chat, and we'll get to them by the end of our session today. So first, as an introduction for the webinar series first, and this is a series of sessions we're hosting that highlight very specific tangible topics for startup ecosystem acceleration. And in these sessions, we cover the work that our partners as well as Startup Genome do with ecosystems around the world, and in supporting their acceleration. Startup Genome works with governments in over 35 countries, helping them with their innovation policies, their innovation economies, and we work with the best of breed partners in all kinds of areas, from acceleration to global market reach, to global connections, to funding policy. And we bring that knowledge that has been accumulated over about a decade into how you can use that for your ecosystem. And because we're looking for more topics on things you might want to learn about, we'd love to get your feedback on the themes you'd like us to cover in future webinars. So please email my colleague Adam, you can see his email on the screen, about the kind of topics you'd like to see in the future. In the past, we've covered topics like funding policy to support startups, specifically during the COVID-19 crisis. We have those webinars available online, and you can see them. These were fantastic sessions where, right in the middle of the crisis, we brought in VCs in Singapore, in Silicon Valley, top funding experts like Professor Josh Lerner at Harvard Business School, government, and policymakers together to really present and discuss what are the right strategies here in terms of funding policy to support companies throughout the crisis. And we've also covered things like global acceleration programs, global mentorship programs. The session we're having right now is one of 4 this week. And as I mentioned, is focused on the X-ray vision of your ecosystem. And this week and for future topics, we also covered how to attract the best talent and international resources for your city through globally positioning your ecosystem. And we're going to have more to come. So stay tuned, and you can find about those in the webinars session of our website. Now for a personal introduction. My name is Arnobio Morelix. I'm Chief Innovation Officer at Startup Genome, and really focused on working with our government members into identifying, what are their needs for new insights, new products, new research, new data science that can leverage their local initiatives on producing more wealth opportunities, more jobs created in their local innovation economies. And in synergy with this work with Startup Genome, I also serve roles with Inc. Magazine and Stanford University. And what I'm excited to share with you today is really to go behind the scenes on a lot of things we don't usually talk about tracking your ecosystem. And really to set the stage on why do we care about this topic at all. The reality is we care very much about it because the global economy is changing dramatically, and this is primarily driven by the rise of the tech economy and the startup economy. And we see this shift in the global economic scene in many ways. One of them is the value created by the global startup economy. Nearly $3 trillion created over a 2.5-year time period just by the startups. So not including the big tech companies that were startups 10 years ago, but now are major corporates. Just the startups, $2.8 trillion, which is on par with the GDP of a G7 economy. Amazing value creation. Another way we see this economic shift is when you look at the largest companies. So now the companies that used to be startups, you will see that 5 out of the 10 largest companies in the world were produced by tech startup ecosystems. So it's Amazon, Google, Facebook, Alibaba, and Tencent. So 3 in the US, 3 in China. And this is the largest such concentration of any industry in the top 10 largest companies. At their heyday, telecom, computers, automotive, they had 3 out of the 10 in the top largest companies. Semiconductors had 2. And you notice that, on this 5 out of 10, we're even excluding Microsoft and Apple. As we see them, more as hardware companies. They're not part of the newest generation of internet-driven tech startups. So this is just amazing evidence of this major economic shift that has happened in the world. And we see that also in job creation. So what you see on the screen there is research I've done in the past for the Kauffman Foundation, which is a multi-billion-dollar philanthropy in the United States focused on entrepreneurship and education. And what the research there has shown over the years from Kauffman and from others is that most of the net job creation in the economies come from new and young companies. The startups are the #1 engine of job creation. The intuition behind this is simple. If you're a large corporate and you're really established and you want to produce more profitability for your shareholders and you want to grow, usually do so by becoming more efficient and cutting staff. Typically, the companies that grow their profits and their top line by adding more people are the new and young companies. Yet, despite this dramatic value creation, so much of it is incredibly concentrated. So what you can see on the screen there is the value creation for the top 100 cities in the world for startup activity. And about 70% of the value created and captured is only in the top 10 performing cities. And this is super worrisome because one, that has all kinds of political implications, employment, labor market implications. 2, many places are not getting their fair share and their fair shot at the innovation economy. And then 3, even in the places that do really well, I'm calling here from San Francisco, most people participating in the city life don't get to enjoy the amazing value produced by the tech economy. So Startup Genome's mission is to break this concentration, especially through learning from one another, through learning, amongst you and your peers around the world. And we do that because we believe the success of your startup should not depend on your region, your gender, your ethnicity, or social background. And we're working to democratize access to the tech economy, to the innovation economy. And this is a especially touching topic for me because I am a Brazilian guy, and when I think back into my home state, we're primarily a industrial and a mining state. And I go back to my family's hometown, and the big employers that used to be there for mining, for steel making, they're just not there anymore. And the jobs that used to be available for young people, young men, young women, are not really there anymore. Uh, and it's so difficult because these jobs are not really coming back. It's really the innovation and the tech driven growth that will shape our economic futures, and that's what we need to bring, and that's what we need to democratize access to. One thing I would add here also is, as this trend was already happening, right? We're already going through a massive shift to the tech and innovation economy. And then all of a sudden, with the COVID-19 trigger crisis and the recovery, this is dramatically accelerated. And it's even more urgent that we democratize access to this tech economy. And, to switch gears a bit here, you might have come across Startup Genome, especially through our global startup ecosystem report. So we launched it about a couple weeks ago, and it's the most popular, the most widely read startup ecosystem report in the world. It gets hundreds of thousands of readers every year, hundreds of media mentions. Our launch a couple weeks ago was in an event co-hosted with the Financial Times and the Next Web. We had an amazing event. Maybe some of you attended, and we had top executives from the most influential tech companies like Google, Amazon, policymakers at the highest level, current and former prime ministers of government, and where we talked about this, renewing economies, but then also about this global startup ecosystem report. And it's relevant and important, and is the best ecosystem ranking and index. But at the same time, this report is a means to an end. It has only about 40 metrics, and it's something to shine light on startup ecosystems. But the work we do with our members at Startup Genome is a lot more detailed than that. We have an ecosystem 360 monitor, which I'll share more with you about today. We have in-depth assessments. We have strategy and action plans. We bring together global experts to execute specific strategies. And what I want to do today is really go behind the scenes of all the things we do beyond the startup ecosystem. And the key takeaway I hope we all get from this presentation is that the world economy has moved on, and it's really a major share of the value creation is coming from the tech and innovation economy. But at the same time, most of our economic development metrics and strategies are stuck in the industrial era. So what we've created over a decade is a new science of ecosystem assessment to help you navigate this transition to an innovation and digital economy. Startup Genome has 5 main services we do for our government members around over 35 countries. And what I want to share with you in more detail about today is our ecosystem 360 monitor, which is really focused on the numbers you need to monitor and compare your startup ecosystem and take action on what's happening. And this ecosystem 360 monitor are ways you can globally benchmark and have X-ray vision into what's happening in your city. Now I want to share with you a sample analysis of this product, and it has 4 main components. One focused on performance, another one focused on funding, another one focused on talent, and finally one focused on community. And I'll really just share a sample of things with you. We do not have time to go through all of it. For our members that use this product, it's a 70-page report that they get every month or every quarter, and I just want to share with you some of the metrics we use for tracking and benchmarking innovation economy. So first, looking at performance, we look at especially at exit activity here. Overall exits, large exits, because we know that large exits function as triggers for the ecosystem, attracting resources and attention nationally and then globally for the city, as well as a look at and breakdown of non-tech exits. And what you'll be able to see when you track this, and you track this is on an ongoing basis, is not only how you're doing long-term in your ecosystem performance across the benchmarks you care the most about, but also how things have changed, in the past month, in the past 2 months, in the past 3 months. This becomes particularly relevant as we're in the middle of a major reshift in our local economies, where we're needing to know things close to real time becomes incredibly important. You cannot rely on something that statistics that are 6 months old, a year old, 2 years old. And I know because I know that's the case many times, because I've done extensive work with statistical agencies around the world, and very often it's just the data is incredibly high quality but takes a long time to come in. So that's one thing we bring in here, very timely statistics that you can use to see what's happening in your ecosystem, and track how your benchmarks are doing, because super important that you do not look just at yourself and your own city. You have to look at what's happening in the rest of the world. Otherwise, you do not really know if you're making progress. You do not really know if you're lagging, or you're catching up with benchmarks, or with your peers, with your aspirations. And the other reason this is super relevant is because you can track triggers in the development of your startup ecosystem. Once you have especially large exits, first at $100 million level, and then at $1 billion level, you start attracting national resources and then global resources for your community. So that was a brief sample of performance. I'd like to share with you now about funding. And funding is something we measure in many different ways. It's we look at overall funding activity, long-term funding growth. We look at early stage funding activity, late stage funding, investor activity, which is really how much are your local investors taking action in the ecosystem now. And then we look at startup runway, which is a way of looking at fundraising for your local startups, taking into account the local costs of running a business, because for example, salaries are widely different around the world, and we need to take that into account. A key thing we learned about funding is that this is the kind of thing you cannot know whether you're doing well or where you're doing poorly, by just asking your startups and by just asking and looking at your own ecosystem. And I've talked to hundreds of founders around the world, and usually if you ask them what's the main challenge in your ecosystem now, odds are you might hear something about funding, because and if the founder is trying to raise a seed round, they're going to say raising seed is really hard. If they're trying to raise Series A, they will say that raising Series A is really hard. And the reality is, even if you ask around in Silicon Valley, you hear that, because funding is hard, and funding is hard everywhere. And in the flip side is, if you ask investors, you get very similar answers too. Investors might say, if they invest in Series B rounds, they will say, well, there's really not enough Series A startups for me to invest around. And what we learned over time is that really know how the funding activity is going, you have to break down into very precise metrics, very precise issues, and you have to globally benchmark things. That's the only way to really know whether the funding activity in a given region is out of line with what should be happening for that ecosystem phase, or whether they're doing well. So we look at several metrics for both long-term and short-term growth. What you can see on the screen now is a longer-term growth for a particular ecosystem, and you see, great great growth there in the number of funding deals for that particular ecosystem. It's important to do these things at different time frames, so you can really tell this story. For example, we're working with a member recently that the key story for them was they are in the longer term, they're doing amazing. They used to be way behind their number one peer and also competitor in their country, but now they're catching up. They've had tremendous growth in the past few years, but when we looked at things in the past 6 months, they're not doing so well. So as you bring all these metrics together, this is the kind of insights you have. You're going to be able to tell what's happening with your ecosystem in the longer term, what's happening in the medium term, and then what's happening in the very short term, so you can take targeted action. So this is a similar chart looking at the total dollar amounts for funding in the ecosystem across time. It's super important as you do this to look not only at the top line numbers, but break down for specific issues. So look at early stage only, late stage only, look at values, look at total amounts, look at the share of large investment rounds happening in the area. There's these very precise issues that you need to evaluate. It's easy to say, look at headline numbers and say your ecosystem could have a funding gap, but funding gap come in very different shapes and forms, and you need to measure it very precisely to know what's happening and where you might be falling behind. So this is tracking of Series A rounds. Here is looking at funding runway, which is, there's costs for running a startup are widely different across cities. And what we do here is look at typical seed and Series A rounds and compare that to software engineer salaries to see roughly how is your ecosystem doing when you take into account the cost of running a startup there. And when you look at it here, the specific example, Helsinki is not doing so well in this metric when you take into account local costs. Another sort of metric we measure has to do with active local investors in specific points in time. This is super relevant now as we get through the COVID-19 crisis and then the recovery, to see how much local money is being deployed in your local ecosystem. Of the many metrics to look at on funding, this is a sample of some of the things I wanted to share. Third major component we study for the ecosystem 360 monitor is talent, and we look at that across metrics of access, across metrics of quality, across metrics of cost, and then we incorporate crowdsourced databases about layoffs and startup layoffs specifically. So what you see on the screen now is what we get from access to local developers. We use data from Github to track software engineer activity around the world and across nearly 300 cities that we study. We look at all developers, but then also top developers, those that have a specific number of followers and a specific prominence in their ecosystem in terms of how their code is used by others. We look at the total shares of high quality top developers as it relates to the number of developers all around. We look at salaries by merging together 3 key salary databases to see, how much does it cost to hire software engineers in your city. And in addition to that, and which we're not showing here, we look at layoffs and the typical experience of startup layoffs in your area. A fourth big component for the Ecosystem 360 monitor is about community. And really here we focused on tech events. And we look at, events activity and events cancellation. And that's everything from the growth in terms of number of events. I mean, no wonder, we're seeing a big drop in event activity since the lockdowns and the COVID-19 crisis. We start to be seeing a pickup, I expect, in the next few months. You can compare how you're doing longer term compared to past years. And then you can also look at what are events cancellation looking like in your area. Okay, so these are the 4 key components for the Ecosystem 360 monitor, and really the things that we use and we think are incredibly important for making decisions about your startup ecosystem: performance, funding, talent, and community. To produce this, we combine all the key global funding and exits databases: Crunchbase, PitchBook, and Dealroom. We're the only organization that does that. Usually, if you're doing this kind of work, you pick one of them and you go with that. And the major advantage here is that some governments try to do this kind of analysis themselves, but usually that takes a team or a few people dedicated close to full time to be able to do all of this. And usually you're going to pick just one of the sources as opposed to all the ones we pull in. And so we get all this funding and exits database, we merge them, we standardize them, we clean them, we pass them through a machine learning algorithm to identify tech startups versus other kinds of companies. We do the same thing to identify the subsectors of the companies we're looking at. With that, we also pull in social signals and web scale data from things like GitHub API, meetup.com, crowdsource lists about layoffs and salaries. And really to summarize all of this is the Ecosystem 360 monitor brings in metrics that matter based on a decade of experience. Startup Genome started almost 10 years ago as a research project with Steve Blank of Lean Startup fame and Chuck Easley. And over time, it developed into this tool that governments in over 35 countries use to understand how they should take action in their ecosystem. And, there's a lot of things you can track, but there's a specific list of the metrics that really matter. A second key point here is that these are comprehensive databases, standardized, cleaned, and aggregated. So we bring all this major funding and exit data together. We work with you so that you can improve your coverage on these metrics and on these databases in the Startup Genome work, but then also for the rest of the world, so that when you have an investor looking for your ecosystem, they're able to find the activity that's happening. This is super important. If you have a lot of deals happening in your city that are secret, it doesn't help. It doesn't help your ecosystem attract attention and attract resources from the rest of your country and the rest of the globe. Finally, this is timely. You get this delivered monthly or quarterly, depending on your needs. You get an interactive dashboard as well as downloadable 70-page PDF deck where you can see each of these metrics and how they are changing long-term, medium-term, short-term. This is especially relevant now as we get through a crisis and the recovery coming from it, because you need to make real-time decisions. And then finally, this is globally benchmarkable. You know, in many ways, this is like your private GSCR, your private global startup ecosystem report, where each month you can see your key benchmarks and your key ecosystems. You can see there a longer list of metrics that gets included in the report, in these reports. And, you know, to switch gears here a bit, one of the things that every Startup Genome member gets and participates on is our global learning community. And it's from people all over the world. And one of the things we realized over time is that successes and failures, well, failures especially, can only be learned through closed doors. Maybe you're able to read about innovation policy successes, innovation program successes in public, but the failures are really just shared under closed doors. So what we do is monthly meetings with our members from all over the world to learn from one another and ask questions, share insights, share ideas, and, you know, test the waters on new initiatives that they think could be done. And one of the things that you know, I think about is that if you are, let's say, a big corporation doing a new product, or you're a big corporation, new product, new service, implementing a new system, you would never dream of launching that product without first talking and really understanding what came before you in that industry, who else is in the industry, what are the successes that previous products had, what are the failures that happened. And, you know, you would talk with experts, you would work with experts to build that new product. So that's what, you know, a corporate would normally do. They would really go into detail learning about what is happening now in the industry and what came before. But with governments, we see that mistake happening all the time. We see governments, you know, doing an accelerator, doing a funding policy, whatever it might be, without really learning from what's already out there, without really learning about what succeeded and what failed. So this peer learning, these global experts that we bring together on a monthly basis, as well as in person when global travel schedules allow, is incredibly important and relevant for governments around the world to make decisions. So as we have done this work around the world, we've really found four biggest barriers to public and private policy action. Number one is confusion, which is misalignment on the community of what you do. Usually comes from a lack of data, a lack of understanding and shared agreement, shared language from identifying what are the problems and what are the potential solutions. Second biggest barrier is dispersion. Sometimes resources are spread too thin, there are too many priorities. I remember talking with a government in North America that they had 47 priorities for the innovation policy. The reality is that, you know, if you have 47 priorities, you don't really have a priority. So this is another major barrier. The third biggest barrier is around timing. You know, sometimes governments do the right action, but at the wrong time. Ecosystems develop in a very predictable life cycle manner that we've mapped out and measured and identified. And it's very important that you time your actions so that they're done at the correct time, so they're not wasting a lot of money and time into things that are just not going to work now. Your ecosystem is not mature enough to do. And then the fourth biggest barrier is around commitment, which is too little investment, to not enough resources to move the needle. And as we produce these metrics and we produce this very reliable global benchmarks, those are the problems we're helping you solve, helping you align with what's happening, so you can time your actions when they make the most sense. Fantastic. So with that, I'm going to conclude the presentation. Thank you very much for coming here today. And we will open up for questions and answers. So I see a lot of people sent questions on the chat and the Q&A. So we'll start going through those. And as you have more of them, please share. Okay. Just one moment, finding the questions. So someone asked, what's for the map of current members, are they the ones that use the 360 monitor service? The vast majority of them, yeah, and some of those members are also have done other products. So that's one of the questions that came up. Someone also asked if we're going to have the deck accessible later, and the answer is yes, we'll do that. Another question we see here is, where's the data coming from? Are you using survey data too? The answer is, for the ecosystem 360 monitor specifically, we do not use survey data. We use data from the sources I showed you. So it's the global exits and funding databases, Crunchbase, Dealroom, PitchBook, as well as web scale data and social signals. We also run a startup survey that looks at things that you cannot get from sources like that, and that frankly you don't need to measure every month, right? Things about the ambition of founders, local connectedness of founders, the market reach of founders, their strategies. It's not something you need to track each month. You can track every year, every 2 years. So, you know, for those interested in that, we absolutely do that through a global survey. Someone asked about their global benchmarks. What are the benchmarks that you can use? Can you choose them? The answer is yes. We have 275 cities that you can choose from for global benchmarking, and we will suggest some to you based on the stage of development you're in, and based on your region of the world, and we'll bring those together for you to pick, really, you know, what are the things what are the ecosystems that it makes the most sense for you to benchmark against. Okay, so another question here I see from Leonardo, which is if we use the Startup Genome database tracking collaboration instruments between public policies in different countries. The answer is yes. We actually have a global database of policies that we've collected over especially around the responses of COVID-19 crisis. And there's over 200 policy measures identified that you can see and access and learn from. In addition to that, we have these ongoing member meetings and peer learning sessions where, you know, we bring together both the data side of things and the metrics, as well as the policies being done to identify, you know, what's moving the needle, what's generating results, what's generating impact. We have a question here about the demographic of founders from Amelia, about race, gender, diversity across various ecosystems. The answer is yes, we do track that. That's a topic that is very important for Startup Genome. It's very important for me in particular as a Latino guy living in the US, and the role I serve with Stanford University is precisely focused on issues of inclusion and entrepreneurship. And we track demographics of founders through the Startup Genome survey, which is done annually or biannually, depending on your choice of ecosystem. This is not a direct part of the ecosystem 360 monitor. It's the full assessment, and we do that there. And what we're implementing now, and it's an ongoing process, is beginning to identify gender of founders from this like web scale data. And it's a feature we're working on for the ecosystem 360 monitor. That's not implemented now, but that we are planning on implementing the next 3 months. And we track the demographics of founders in this survey. And then not just race and gender, but also socioeconomic background, like what kind of family support they had before starting their company. We track LGBTQ orientation for founders all over the world, including in the regions and countries where that is a more sensitive topic than in other places. And we use those to look at how the founder experience varies for different groups. Super important topic and something we do. So I'm taking a moment here. David asked, what's needed to be a network member for Startup Genome? So basically, you work with Startup Genome in some of these offerings. For example, the Ecosystem 360 Monitor, as we covered, or other options. And the key next step here is talk with Adam. And I'll share my screen again so you can see. Just give me one moment. So to become a network member, the key next step is talking with Adam. And you can see his email and contact on the screen. And Adam can walk you through the next steps for becoming a Startup Genome member. And would love to have you join. Okay, so I had a question from Xavier about the metrics used to assess ecosystem performance. The key things we use have to do with exit activity of different sizes. So the companies in the ecosystem exiting. We look at startup output, which is something you can choose optionally for your ecosystem, which is a metric of how many startups are there in your ecosystem. The way we calculate it is through a multiple systems estimate methodology that is basically inspired by wildlife statistics, where if you want to know how many lions are there in a specific area, you go and you start tagging them, and you come back a few times, and once you start seeing the same lions with the same tags again, you can put that into the model to see what's the likely percentage of population that you covered. So we work with accelerators, incubators, local entrepreneurship support organizations of all kinds to identify how many startups they've worked with, and then we merge that into our own global database of companies. We have about 1 million companies in the database, and bringing those together, we're able to estimate the number of startups in the ecosystem and how much that's growing. So that's a metric of performance also, and one we use especially for our global startup ecosystem report and for our in-depth assessment is ecosystem value, which is how much value is being created in the ecosystem by the companies in the area. So those are some of the key metrics of performance. For members that work with us in more detail on strategy, product, and action plans, we also look at job creation, and we estimate in the future the growth rates and where the ecosystem is likely to go, and how they can get there in terms of value creation and job creation. Fantastic. So I'm checking here for any other questions we may have. So give me one moment. Okay, so someone asked like how is this ecosystem 360 monitor different from other options? And the main, really there's two alternatives that we sometimes see people using. One of them is governments trying to do it themselves, and usually you end up picking up one source and go with that. Maybe your national VC group or something of the like, or Crunchbase or a specific source, and then you try to have an analyst compile these things internally. That's incredibly costly. It takes you a lot of time and money and internal resources, and usually you're not going to have global benchmarks. So by what we do here that you cannot replicate by yourself, and there's no other alternative that does, is aggregate all the major important global sources, merge them together, aggregate, clean them, pass them through this machine learning algorithm to classify the companies, and really only target the tech startups. And we produce that in a timely manner, like monthly or quarterly, depending on your needs. So that's the key thing that's very different than anything else you could do on your own or with alternatives. Fantastic. So I think we covered all the questions you've had. I want to bring you here a final takeaway, which is most of our economic development metrics that governments use and also the strategies are really stuck in the industrial era. But the world has moved on. The major value creation in the economy is coming from tech and the innovation industry. It's not coming from the typical industrial era initiatives we think about, and that still dominate economic development, not the strategies but also the metrics. So what we've done here is build a new science for economic development, so you can track the metrics and identify the strategies that really matter for the new economy, the innovation economy. We hope to be in touch with you, and please reach out to my colleague Adam, our Director of Business Development and Partnerships, to find out more and discuss next steps with our team. And especially if you have any further questions that you want to discuss in private, we'll be very happy to do that with you. This concludes our webinar for today. Thank you so much for joining. I appreciate it, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Goodbye.